Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce you, Mike Walsh, a author of the Algorithmic Leader and also the Futurist. Mike, welcome to the session. Nice to have you here.
It's good to be here, although I'd much rather be in Tokyo in person. It's a wonderful city.
It is. You've been working with Japanese companies before, I heard.
I have. I've had the pleasure of visiting a number of times to Japan. For many years, I went to Tokyo for my inspiration because I think it's one of those unique cities and countries where you can really glimpse the future.
I see. Okay, so about this book, right? What was your motivation to write this book? Because there are so many books talking about the use cases, how to apply the new technology to the new business. But why did you focus on the leadership?
What I realized was that there were a lot of books that were technical in nature, teaching you how to program or understand information technology. And when it came to artificial intelligence and robotics, most of the books were really about the dangers that AI was going to take over or destroy our jobs, or we were going to bring about some kind of apocalypse. But what I realized was that throughout human history, we've always invented tools that helped us be more efficient and productive. But that hasn't replaced us as human beings. It just meant that we as people had to change. So I thought what we needed was not another book about technology. We needed a book about leadership and about how we as leaders and organizations need to reinvent ourselves now that we've invented these very powerful tools.
Okay, I see. So, well, in Japan, we have a new prime minister, and then he decided to establish the Ministry of Digital. So now became a digital transformation in AI. It's not just the buzzword for the business context, but the buzzword for everybody. So what is it really, the digital transformation, if you need to define? Because this is the concept, the still black concept, that people have so many versions of the definition about it.
I think the best place to start is to say what digital transformation is not. Digital transformation is not digital incrementalism. So if you're implementing some technology you've bought from a vendor that is going to give you a 10% improvement in costs, or you can reduce 10% of your FTE headcount, that is not a transformation. That's just a more continuous improvement type innovation. Real digital transformation is about starting with a clean sheet of paper and asking yourself, what is now possible in an age of AI, data, and algorithms that wasn't possible before? How do we reconceive what we do and how we deliver value? How do we change and reimagine how we work? And how do we redefine competition in our industry? These are digital transformation questions.
I see. Interesting. So what is it then? What is it so different from the past industrial revolutions?
I think it's a really good question, Go-san, because in the past, industrial technological revolutions were generally about replacing human work. It was about efficiency and automation. But what's happening differently this time is that the systems that we build now have the ability to learn at scale. So they can start to see patterns and possibilities that we cannot. So this is a different kind of work, which makes possible a very different kind of organization. And the changes we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, as we see the dawn of these new, truly AI-powered organizations, is going to be an exponential level of change that we've never seen in previous industrial revolutions.
Interesting. So from the leadership perspective, what's the key area that he or she needs to enhance to cope with this digital transformation, if that is so different from the industrial revolutions?
The good news, bad news with this is that in some ways, this isn't just about technology. It's not just about hiring more scientists and programmers and coders. That is good and bad news, because although that would be very expensive, it's relatively easy to do. What we need to change is not as expensive, but it's much more difficult. It's culture. How do you transform the culture of the way you do things? And when I say culture, I don't mean how we feel about the company or how we treat each other. I think about culture as an operating system, a system of interactions of how people make decisions, how people collaborate, how they get things done. And this is the hardest thing to change. I mean, a great example in Japan in the pandemic has been how the Hanko culture has been challenged. I mean, but if we hadn't have had the pandemic, I think we would have been putting little seals on things for maybe another 100 years. So sometimes it takes really a complete change in the external situation for us to question the culture of doing things.
Understood. So Japanese culture have a big respect for the traditions, right? If that's a good news and bad news for you. So if that's the base statement, what need to have for them to change in order to cope with the digital age, other than sense of urgency?
Yes, it's sometimes when people try to do a cultural change, they try to change everything. It's funny. The quote at the beginning of the book is actually from one of my favorite Italian books, Il Gattopardo, which means the leopard. And it says, in order for things to stay the same, everything must change. And what they're basically saying is that sometimes in order to continue to do things the way they've always been done, we actually have to use so much energy. It's ridiculous how hard we have to work in order to prevent change. So, especially in traditional Japanese organizations, the answer isn't to eliminate everything that's traditional or everything we've done in the past. It's to find the things that actually work and the things that fit in this new model, and to focus on those and build from. Japanese organizations are very hierarchical, but they're also very collaborative. In fact, they're much more collaborative than American organizations. Americans have had to learn how to play nicely with each other. They're much more individualistic. And so I think finding those values in traditional Japanese organizations and building on those, the successes of the Toyota management model. There have been many examples of real innovation in Japanese culture. We just need to potentially adjust those for the future.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about the middle management. In order to implement the new processes to cope with the new customer demand, middle management people need to change. They need to redefine their roles and responsibility per se. So how do they do that? How do you do that as a leader? How do you make them change?
I think one of the themes that I talk about in the book is we have to rethink what a leader is. In the past, we assumed that a leader means someone who is literally out in front and is telling everyone what to do. And you have a very hierarchical structure underneath of people like the military following orders. But the leader of the future has to realize that sometimes the best decision to make is not to make a decision. It's to design a system to make the decision for you. Sometimes the best way to run a team is to let the team run itself. So it's almost a paradox. So especially for middle management, I think there has to be a realization that their real work in the future is not to actually do the work that's handed to them. It's to design a better way of doing things. In a way, every day we have to go to work and we have to think, how do we destroy our own jobs? How do we better use data, automation, technology to do the job we do today? And that's going to be difficult if in the past we've always worried about full-time employment or job security, because it's job insecurity that will power the real transformation.
So Mike, our readers are very much interested in how do we apply your theme of the book to the Japanese corporations, because they are unique in many ways. Based on your study, what was the notable successful scenario of the digital transformation of the Japanese companies, or not the other way around? Any insight you can provide as the missing point or missing agenda in Japanese companies' digital transformation?
I really see two very different examples in Japanese industry. One is the very traditional Japanese organizations. And I think for many of those, their focus has been, say, on manufacturing excellence and efficiency in production. And I think what we're seeing now is the use of Industry 4.0, data and sensors to not only change their operations, but I'm thinking about one Japanese manufacturing company in particular who actually brought those innovations to their customers. Because it's only by having an end-to-end system where everyone in your value chain is using the right digital technologies, accelerated decision making, that's where you get the real transformation. But the other interesting area, I think, is the new generation Japanese organizations that have only been started in the last 5 to 10 years. They're often run by much younger founders. They're very digital, they're very technological. And what's happened in the last 12 months during the pandemic is a number of these have rapidly become a lot more influential and have really realized their potential, I think, years earlier than they would have otherwise.
Right. So I think, what would be your advice to, not for the those new generations company, but the old traditional companies, because the a leader of those companies, even though one individual has a very sophisticated way of thinking and an innovative way of thinking, their huge asset, traditional asset, prevent them from doing that. So what would be your advice of how they act?
There are many different approaches. I think the starting point is to have the right leadership structure in place. We've talked about this before. You know, there's often a temptation in big traditional Japanese organizations for the very senior leader, you know, who maybe, you know, has worked in this industry for many years, to now think that they have to be the one who now needs to learn programming or Python or JavaScript. But actually what needs to really happen is a much broader cultural transformation. But you do need someone senior who is going to be the chief digital officer, who's going to be responsible for thinking about the new business models, new ways of working, both internally and externally. But the important thing is that person is not working in IT. This is not an IT project. This is someone who has the authority to really reinvent new business models and potentially do it in new parts of the organization without risking the core. I'm thinking of one particular Japanese trading group who is involved in the energy business, and they were actually doing a lot of their experimentation offshore. So they were partnering with startups, investing in technology platforms and trying new business models outside of Japan. And when things work, then bringing it back.
Okay, interesting. So you raised the interesting point that in order to become the futuristic leader, not the knowledge of technology is just only key. So, well, having said that, what level of technology knowledge one leader should have, and then how do they acquire to it?
It's like anything in business. More important than knowing the right answer is knowing how to ask the right questions. And one of the things that I try to achieve in the book is to give Japanese leaders the right questions to ask of their technical people. Because the right questions aren't, how did you program this, or how did you design this AI model? The right questions are, you know, what are we trying to achieve? Have we considered all the risks in terms of bias and ethics? Are we protecting data correctly? Is there a smarter way of structuring this organization? Is there a smarter way of working? What would a new generation competitor like Amazon or Google do in my sector if they were now going to work in finance or construction or retail? These are leadership questions. And I think knowing how to ask them and knowing how to understand the answers, that's the kind of knowledge that Japanese leaders need.
Okay. So I want to ask you the question around that how do they run the R&D? Traditionally, exclusive style R&D and the exclusive style new technology development was really the key advantage for the Japanese company. That's how they run the business. So, in order to cope with this open source ecosystem ages, how do they transform their way of thinking to create a value to the market?
It's a really good point, and this debate about closed R&D versus open ecosystems has been something that has really changed a lot in the last 20 years. I mean, you go back 20 years ago, and even the big software giants in the United States, like Microsoft, were completely against open source. And now they've not only embraced it, it's at the core of what they do. And I think there's a realization now that the pace of change is so extraordinary that it's almost impossible for one organization to be able to attract enough talent to work on really complex problems that will drive value in the future. So it isn't just software. Whether you're in agriculture or logistics, retail or pharmaceuticals, there's core sets of technologies and new business models that require, I think, organizations to not only partner more openly with other people in the ecosystem, it requires a very different way of thinking about R&D as well.
Okay. Okay, so Mike, in order for the Japanese corporation to cope with the digital transformations, how do they consider their past advantage, past asset, such as the lifetime employment and the culture of the continuous improvement, which is really the virtue of the Japanese corporation? Now it is hard to grasp. So how do they cope with it?
If you remember right at the start of our conversation, we talked about that the hardest part of digital transformation is cultural change. But cultural change doesn't come from just taking someone else's culture or trying to copy the culture of somebody else. It comes from within. And if you look more broadly, I believe over the last 50 years, Japanese organizations were not constrained by values. It's their ability to form new values is what made them so effective and powerful. The ability to systematize. So now I think the question is, what are the new values that Japanese organizations need to evolve and adopt in order to be successful? So instead of continuous improvement, it now needs to become the value of continuous disruption. Rather than lifetime employment, instead we need lifetime mobility and learning. Rather than Kiretsu networks, we need adaptive ecosystems. In summary, we need to move from a closed model to one that's more open, agile, adaptive, and of course, resilient.
So Mike, Japanese companies, their virtue is really used to reside on the lifetime employment and then the continuous improvement. That was really the strongest point of the Japanese corporation. But having a conversation with you, that's not necessarily the strongest point for the digital age. How do they transform by having that types of the advantage, past advantage within their corporation?
It's a really good question. And if you remember when we first started talking today, we spoke about culture and values being the most important part of any transformation. What we often forget is that values are not rules. They are practices and beliefs that emerged to help us at a point in time in order to be more successful or effective and productive. So now is the time for us, I think, to reevaluate those values, to ask whether not only are they still relevant in this new algorithmic age, but how do they need to change in order to be useful? So what if instead of talking about continuous improvement, we instead considered continuous disruption? Instead of lifetime employment, we start to think about, well, what about lifetime mobility and learning? Instead of Kiretsu networks, what if we could instead focus on building adaptive ecosystems that are open? So it's only, I think, by reconsidering our values that we can truly make them powerful.
Okay. Thank you. So this is my last question. So for the readers of the book and then the listener of the sessions, this is a big enlightenment session, I think. So, which is good, really. But however, from the tomorrow, they go back to their own business again, and they're surrounded by traditional way of thinking employees, and they're getting swamped by a day-to-day business, really busy business. So how do you keep your focus and the momentum to change the operating system of your corporations?
I think there's two things that you can do that will really help you to stay focused. The first is to write a personal transformation plan. So don't worry about the organization, don't worry about your team. Ask what can you do personally in your role to help make transformation more of a reality for the organization, either through technology or through culture change or even your own practices. What is within your own power to do? And the second thing you should do is to, of course, get a copy for your colleague and teammate so that they also understand. And then, start a conversation group on whatever collaboration you platform and start looking for your own stories of transformation. Maybe not just inside your organization, but your competitors, other industries, other countries. Because the more you can start the conversation about change, that is where the real insights come from.
That's really nice. Thank you, Mike, for all the inputs. That was very, very valuable, not only for me, but for all the listeners. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.